What happens when the most powerful man in the world mistakes devotion for possession and tries to bend reality to match his grief? In Rome, the answer wasn't whispered in palace corridors. It walked the marble streets in broad daylight, dressed in silk and jewels, forcing an empire to applaud a lie. Nero didn't start as a monster. He was a prodigy crowned too early, adored by crowds who thought a golden age had arrived. But power, without limits, doesn't stay gentle. It hardens into paranoia, then obsession, and finally, something colder, ownership. One loss pushed him over the edge. One face dragged him into a fantasy he refused to wake from. This is the story behind that face, a teenager pulled into the orbit of an emperor who couldn't let go, a court that learned to smile at the impossible, and a city that watched a love story curdle into control. If you think you know Roman decadence, you don't know this. And the first clue lies in how Nero rose, promising mercy, funding spectacle, and learning that applause can drown out the truth. At just 16 years old, Nero slipped the laurel crown onto his head and stepped into history. The Senate and people of Rome expected little from him. He was young, inexperienced, and overshadowed by powerful advisors. Yet, against all odds, his first years brought hope. Taxes were eased, public games dazzled the crowds, and for the first time in memory, an emperor stood on stage performing music and plays for ordinary citizens. To the people, it looked like a golden dawn. But applause can be more dangerous than any dagger. Every cheer convinced Nero that he was not simply ruling Rome, he was Rome. Soon, whispers of humility faded, and the boy who once bowed to his tutors began to believe the world itself was his stage. And when the stage is yours, who dares tell you when the play has gone too far? Behind the curtain of triumph, cracks spread, paranoia seeped in. What if the senators who praised him today plotted against him tomorrow? What if the generals adored by the legions dreamed of wearing his crown? The young emperor's smile hid sleepless nights, haunted by the thought that trust itself was a luxury he could never afford. And then came Poppaea Sabina, the woman whose beauty and ambition would ignite a fire inside him that burned away the last traces of restraint. Poppaea Sabina was no ordinary beauty. She didn't simply walk into a room, she commanded it. Her eyes were sharp, her laughter magnetic, and her presence a dangerous cocktail of charm and ambition. To Nero, trapped in a loveless political marriage with Octavia, she was everything he thought he deserved but had been denied. Where Octavia kept her head down, Poppaea lifted hers high. At first, their affair was just another Roman scandal, hardly unusual in an empire where gossip flowed faster than wine. But Nero's fascination with Poppaea was different. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't even love. It was possession. He couldn't stand the idea of her drawing the gaze of other men. Guards were stationed around her, not to protect her, but to watch her. He bankrupted treasuries to shower her with jewels from the East, silks from the far reaches of Asia, perfumes rare enough to scent the air of entire banquets. Those around him saw the warning signs. Advisors whispered that his obsession had crossed the line into madness, but no one dared stop him. In Rome, survival often meant silence, and silence allowed the emperor's hunger to grow unchecked. Eventually, Nero took the unthinkable step. He divorced Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, and made Poppaea his wife in a wedding more lavish than any before. To the world, it was a union sealed with power and splendor. But behind the golden veils and marble halls, it was something darker. A man who had confused desire with ownership, and a woman walking a tightrope between influence and danger. For a time, Poppaea played her role with brilliance. She maneuvered through politics, elevated her allies, and even dared to challenge Nero's decisions. But Nero was not a man who tolerated defiance, and one fateful day, her courage clashed with his volatility, with consequences Rome would never forget. It began like any other quarrel inside the palace walls, a husband returning late, a wife bold enough to speak her mind. But this was no ordinary husband, and Poppaea was no ordinary wife. She carried within her the child that could have secured Nero's dynasty, a symbol of hope for the empire. Ancient historians disagree on the details. Some say Poppaea mocked Nero's endless obsession with chariot racing. Others claim she accused him of caring more for his stage performances than his duties as emperor. But all accounts agree on one thing: Nero lost control. In a storm of fury, he struck her. Whether a single violent blow or a sustained attack, we may never know. What we do know is that the strike killed both Poppaea and the unborn child she carried. In that moment, the emperor who commanded armies, who bent senators to his will, who was worshipped as a god, destroyed the only person he truly cared for. Power couldn't undo what he had done. Authority couldn't raise her from the marble floor, and grief consumed him like fire. Nero's mourning was not the mourning of an ordinary man. He refused the traditional rites, having her body embalmed instead of burned, entombed in splendor that rivaled the greatest emperors. He declared her divine, ordered cults in her honor, and spoke to her corpse as though she still breathed. Courtiers were forced to play along, referring to her in the present tense, leaving her seat open at banquets, pretending she lived on. To question this illusion was to invite exile or death. The Emperor of Rome was now a prisoner of his own madness, and in his obsession to undo the irreversible, he began searching for a ghost to fill the void Poppaea left behind. That ghost would soon take the form of a boy named Sporus. Sporus was just a teenager when fate pushed him into the emperor's gaze. Born into slavery within the imperial household, later freed but still tied to the palace, he had no reason to expect greatness or tragedy. He wasn't a soldier, orator, or senator. He was a boy trained for administrative service, a life lived in the shadows of power. But Sporus carried something that would change everything: his face. Ancient writers say he bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea Sabina, especially in the delicate structure of his eyes and cheeks. In Rome, where people believed appearance hinted at deeper spiritual bonds, that likeness was more than striking. It was eerie. When Nero saw Sporus for the first time after Poppaea's death, it was as if the emperor's grief cracked wide open. To his broken mind, the boy wasn't simply a freedman serving the household. He was a chance to reverse destiny, to resurrect the woman he had destroyed. There was, of course, one obstacle. Sporus was male. But to a ruler who considered himself divine, gender was no barrier. If Nero could command legions and silence the Senate, why not command reality itself? And so began one of history's most chilling transformations. A boy forced to surrender not only his freedom, but his very identity. What came next would erase Sporus as he had once been and remake him into something the emperor demanded: a living ghost of Poppaea. Nero's obsession wasn't satisfied with mere resemblance. He didn't just want Sporus to look like Poppaea. He wanted him to become her. And in the emperor's twisted logic, there was only one way to erase the differences: surgery. He summoned Rome's finest physicians, ordering them to alter the boy's body in ways no sane mind would demand. Ancient procedures were crude and agonizing, blades, fire, and herbs standing in for anesthesia. Sporus would have been pinned down as the doctors obeyed, his screams echoing off the marble walls of the palace. Survival itself was uncertain, but Nero didn't care. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was creation. When Sporus finally staggered back from the brink, he was forever changed. His body had been mutilated, his future stolen. Yet the torment was only beginning. From that day forward, Nero forced a complete remaking of his identity. Imperial seamstresses stitched gowns tailored to disguise what remained of his masculinity. Jewelers crafted ornaments once worn by Poppaea, binding Sporus to her memory with every glittering stone. Cosmetics were painted onto his face, softening his features until the boy in the mirror disappeared. Tutors drilled him on posture, gestures, and voice, teaching him to sit, walk, and even laugh, as a Roman empress would. Every word, every movement became a lesson in erasure. The result was not a person, but a performance, a living echo of a woman long dead. For Nero, this grotesque theater was proof of his power over life itself. For Sporus, it was the slow destruction of everything he had ever been. And then, as if this nightmare wasn't enough, Nero decided to make the illusion permanent in the most public way possible. He would marry Sporus, not as a scandalous affair, but as a full imperial wedding before the eyes of Rome. Spring of 67 AD. Rome prepared for a spectacle unlike any it had ever seen. Not a gladiatorial contest, not a triumphal parade, but a wedding. The emperor himself would take a new bride, and nothing less than the grandeur of an imperial ceremony would do. The palace was transformed into a stage. Halls glittered with imported flowers, torches lit the night like stars, and musicians rehearsed the sacred hymns of matrimony. Guests whispered in disbelief, yet none dared speak aloud what they all knew. The bride was not a woman, but a teenage boy carved into a replica of Poppaea. Sporus, now renamed Sabina, was dressed in gowns sewn to perfection, dripping with jewels that once adorned the dead empress. His hair was curled in elaborate Roman styles, his face powdered to soften the last traces of the boy he had been. To the watching crowd, he looked the part. To those who knew the truth, it was a living ghost. The ceremony followed every tradition. Vows were exchanged, hands were clasped, sacred bread was shared. Senators, nobles, and courtiers lined the hall, their smiles frozen, their congratulations forced. Applause filled the air, but beneath it pulsed an unspoken horror. They were not witnessing a marriage, but the emperor's fantasy made flesh. From that day forward, Sporus lived as Rome's empress. He was given his own staff, chambers, and income from the imperial treasury. He sat beside Nero at banquets, traveled in his litter, and was addressed by the name of a woman long dead. Every act reinforced the fiction, that Poppaea had returned, and that the emperor had power not only over men, but over reality itself. For Sporus, survival meant constant performance. Every glance, every word, every gesture had to match the illusion. A single slip could mean death. But Nero was convinced. To him, the past had been resurrected. To Sporus, the present was a prison with no escape. And yet, his ordeal was far from over, because Nero's thirst for spectacle would soon take them both far from Rome. For a time, the illusion held. Sporus played the role of empress so flawlessly that even foreign dignitaries were forced to accept the fiction. When Nero paraded through the empire, Sporus rode beside him, draped in silks, crowned in jewels, a silent testament to the emperor's delusion. But Nero's hunger for attention was insatiable. He longed not only for Rome's applause, but for the admiration of Greece, the land of poets, philosophers, and theater. So, in 66 AD, he set out on a grand tour. Everywhere he went, he demanded audiences, competing in festivals and insisting on victory, no matter how poorly he performed. And at his side, Sporus appeared as the Empress of Rome. Imagine the whispers among Greek nobles, forced to bow before a boy in a gown, pretending not to notice the farce staged before their eyes. Meanwhile, rebellions simmered back home. Nero's extravagance had drained the treasury, his paranoia alienated senators, and his neglect of the army turned generals into rivals. By 68 AD, the empire erupted. Governors declared revolt, the Senate branded Nero an enemy of the state, and even his own Praetorian Guard turned against him. The emperor, who once believed himself untouchable, fled the city in disguise, clinging to a handful of loyalists. And with him went Sporus, still dressed as an empress, still trapped in the fantasy, even as the empire itself crumbled. In a villa on the outskirts of Rome, Nero raged, wept, and plotted desperate escapes. At times, he imagined fleeing east to raise armies. At others, he rehearsed dramatic last words, as though life itself were a stage. But when word came that soldiers were closing in, even he could no longer deny the truth. Cornered and abandoned, Nero chose death over capture, ending his reign with the same chaos that defined it. For Sporus, the emperor's fall should have meant freedom. Instead, it marked the beginning of a darker chapter, because Rome wasn't done with him yet. Nero's death should have closed the curtain on Sporus's torment. But in Rome, power didn't die with an emperor. It shifted, hungry for new hands to claim it. And Sporus, the boy who had been forced into a ghost, was far too valuable and far too infamous to simply disappear. Almost immediately, he became a prize. First claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander of the Praetorian Guard, Sporus was paraded as a token of legitimacy, the living reminder of Nero's twisted court. Then, when Otho briefly seized power, he too took possession of Sporus, calling him Sabina, and forcing the charade to continue. Later, Vitellius claimed the throne, and with it, the empress. Each man used Sporus not as a person, but as property, a symbol of their hold over Rome's most grotesque legacy. But Vitellius took the cruelty further. He planned to use Sporus in the arena, forcing him to act out scenes of myth where humiliation and violence would entertain thousands. For a boy who had been stripped of choice, stripped of self, this was the final degradation, the transformation of his suffering into public spectacle. Faced with that horror, Sporus made the only decision that was truly his own. He chose death. Ancient accounts say poison was his escape, though the details are lost. What remains certain is that before his 20th birthday, he was gone, erased not just by Nero's obsession, but by Rome's indifference. His story might have ended there, buried in the dust of imperial decadence. Yet the tragedy of Sporus lingers, because it was never only about one boy. It was about what happens when absolute power sees human beings not as lives to be cherished, but as objects to be molded, possessed, and discarded. Sporus's life was short, but it carved a scar across history. He was never a senator, never a general, never a hero sung in marble or bronze. He was something more haunting, a reminder of how power without limits can consume the powerless. From the moment Nero decided Sporus resembled Poppaea, his identity ceased to belong to him. He was renamed, remade, rehearsed into a performance so complete that the boy he once was vanished into shadows. For years, he lived as a reflection of someone else's fantasy, trapped in silks and jewels that felt more like chains than honors. And yet, in the end, his final act was his own. By choosing death rather than degradation in the arena, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied to him for so long: choice. It was a tragic victory, but a victory nonetheless. A refusal to let Rome turn his torment into entertainment. What makes Sporus' story unforgettable isn't just the cruelty he endured, it's the silence around him. The fact that ancient historians recorded him less as a person and more as a symbol of Nero's excess. His hopes, his dreams, the sound of his laughter, the things that made him human, all of it was erased. What survives is the echo of a boy turned into a doll, forced to act out a role he never wanted. 2,000 years later, his story still asks an uncomfortable question. How many other voices have been lost because the powerful decided they didn't matter? In the end, Sporus was not just a victim of Nero. He was a mirror of Rome itself, a civilization that glorified power, silenced weakness, and left behind tales of grandeur while burying the human cost. And perhaps that's why his story still lingers. Because behind every empire's marble facade, there are forgotten lives, reminders that history is not only written in victories, but in the suffering of those who had no say in their fate.